While Putin has been busy fighting the West for more land, China quietly moved into the territory Russia thought it already owned. Unlike his victim, Xi didn't need tanks or battles. He used patience, money, and deals to rewrite the map without ever firing a single shot. Central Asia, once Moscow's crown jewel, now hums with Chinese-built roads, pipelines, and decisive authority. And here's the kicker. Many of Russia's old Soviet allies helped make it happen, betraying Russia for a seat at China's table. In this video, we'll show how Beijing outplayed the Kremlin, reshaped the region, and turned the so-called China-Russia alliance into perhaps the greatest geopolitical bait and switch of our time. For more than a century, maps of Eurasia were drawn in Moscow. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan were all stamped into the Soviet sphere as Russia's proud southern flank. To the old Soviet planners, it was their backyard, a buffer zone against everything foreign and unpredictable. Today, that same map is being redrawn. It's being rewritten with trade routes, loans, and construction cranes. But now the hand holding the pen is Chinese. That is the quiet revolution happening across the heart of Eurasia. Interestingly, China didn't march an army into Central Asia, it built a marketplace. While Russia spent attention, money, and credibility on the battlefield in Ukraine, Beijing was paving roads, funding factories, and signing deals that stitched the region's economies to its own. Economic power has become the new currency of the empire, and China is spending it generously. In the first half of this year alone, Chinese investments and construction contracts under the Belt and Road Initiative hit $25 billion in Central Asia, a record surge of 257% from the year before. That kind of cash flow buys futures. Control of Central Asia isn't just about lines on a map. It's about energy, the oil, gas, and uranium buried in those deserts. It's about access, the trade corridors that link Europe to Asia, where trains now carry Chinese goods west faster than ships can move them. It's about leverage, the ability to shape how 5 independent nations vote, trade, and partner on the world stage. Whoever commands Central Asia commands one of the most strategic crossroads on Earth. And for the first time in modern history, that command might not come from Moscow. So, if Putin's own backyard is slipping into Beijing's orbit, what does that say about Russian power? And how did it lose such a valuable region in the first place? Well, the answer starts with how Russia got this backyard in the first place. When the Tsars began their imperial march east in the 18th and 19th centuries, Central Asia was a patchwork of khanates, tribes, and trade routes that had thrived for centuries along the old Silk Road. Moscow didn't conquer it for ideology, it conquered it for control of territory, for trade, and for prestige. By the late 1800s, the Russian Empire had absorbed most of what was now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The region was renamed, reorganized, and folded into the empire's fabric. Railways were laid that connected Tashkent to Moscow, leading Russian settlers to arrive in waves. Politically, local leaders were replaced with Moscow-appointed administrators, who reported directly to St. Petersburg. Then came the Soviet era, and the grip tightened even more. Lenin's vision of unity was, in practice, an empire by another name. Central Asia became a hub for industrial and agricultural development within the USSR. Russian was the language of education, the passport to opportunity, and the currency of power. Soviet planners built massive rail lines, hydroelectric dams, and military installations across the region. They turned it into a vital logistical artery that linked European Russia to the borders of China, Afghanistan, and Iran. In cities like Almaty and Tashkent, Soviet soldiers marched in parades that reminded everyone who was in charge. By the 1980s, it was unthinkable that Moscow would ever lose control there. Central Asia was not just a territory, it was identity, an inseparable part of what Russians saw as their geopolitical destiny. However, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 shattered that illusion overnight. Suddenly, 5 new nations were born, each scrambling to define itself, while still tethered to the old imperial center. For Russia, the collapse was humiliating, but not yet fatal. After all, the old networks remained. Russian troops still guarded borders. Russian remained the lingua franca, or the main language, and millions of Central Asian workers continued to migrate north to fill Russian factories, farms, and construction sites. Throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, Moscow kept its influence through what looked like mutual need. The newly independent states needed markets, weapons, and jobs. Russia offered all 3. Through the Collective Security Treaty Organization, it promised military protection. Through the Eurasian Economic Union, it kept trade flowing. To many leaders in the region, Moscow meant stability. Not always prosperity, but predictability. It was the default option. But that old order began to crack long before the world noticed. Not because Putin suddenly lost interest, but because another power showed up with deeper pockets and a different approach. You see, China didn't send soldiers, it sent engineers. It didn't demand loyalty, it offered loans. Where Russia brought nostalgia, China brought blueprints and cash. The shift began subtly in the early 2000s, when China's economy exploded and Beijing began looking west for energy and influence. The Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, was the masterstroke. Under it, China poured billions into roads, railways, and pipelines that would link Western China to Europe. All this would be through Central Asia. This wasn't aid, it was an investment, with strings tied neatly in the form of long-term debt, infrastructure control, and market dependency. Moscow didn't immediately see it as a threat. After all, Beijing was technically a partner. But slowly, Beijing was building the very networks that once defined Russian power and rerouting them towards itself. While Putin focused on reclaiming parts of the former Soviet Union through military might, in Georgia, Crimea, and eventually Ukraine, China focused on reclaiming influence through economics. And the contrast couldn't have been sharper. One sought dominance through force, the other through function. And in Central Asia, where stability and growth matter more than political allegiances, China's offer started to look a lot more appealing. When you look closely, Russia didn't lose Central Asia overnight, it lost it piece by piece, through distraction, arrogance, and just bad timing. The first and biggest problem was focus. Putin built his modern power on the idea that Russia could juggle everything at once. This included wars, sanctions, prestige, and partnerships. But the invasion of Ukraine shattered that illusion. By 2022, Russia was throwing most of its political and financial weight into the war, leaving everything else to just drift. Diplomats who once frequented Astana and Tashkent were reassigned to manage damage control in Europe. Military officers responsible for joint training missions in Central Asia were now fighting or dying in Donbass. The region noticed the absence immediately. Moscow wasn't just distracted, it was consumed. That tunnel vision carries a heavy price. Central Asia's leaders see the writing on the wall. Russia is overstretched and losing credibility. Every missile fired into Ukraine makes Moscow look more desperate and less reliable. As the war drags on, Putin's government burns through not just troops and money, but moral authority. How can it promise stability abroad when it can't even deliver it at home? Then comes the economic collapse. Sanctions have hit Russia like a slow-moving train wreck. Each new package from the West tightens the screws, raising costs, blocking transactions, and making it harder for money to move in or out of the country. Oil exports, once the backbone of Russia's economy, have dropped sharply. This year alone, volumes fell by over 20%, and many shipments are now sold at steep discounts just to keep the cash flowing. Payment systems are under pressure, foreign reserves are shrinking, and the ruble continues to wobble. Russia's financial arteries haven't been severed, but they're clogged, and the damage is spreading. Central Asia feels this heavily. These economies are still tied to Russia through trade, investment, and remittances. Millions of migrant workers from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan rely on Russian jobs to send money home. In Tajikistan, remittances make up nearly a third of GDP. When Russia slows down, those payments shrink. Projects stall, salaries go unpaid, and Russian investors quietly back out of deals they once promised to fund. The result is a regional slowdown that hits the hardest in places already struggling to grow. Meanwhile, the trade numbers tell a story Moscow doesn't want to hear. China's exports to Russia have dropped sharply this year, down by double digits, as companies pull back to avoid secondary sanctions. Imports from Russia have also fallen, leaving smaller refineries and manufacturers scrambling for buyers. Chinese firms aren't making a political statement, they're protecting their bottom line. Risking access to Western markets just to keep Russian contacts really isn't worth it. That leaves Russia isolated, with fewer partners and fewer options. The war has also drained the Russian military's credibility. In Soviet times, Moscow's strength in Central Asia came from its security guarantees, the unspoken promise that if anything went wrong, Russian troops would fix it. But this year, that illusion has cracked. The same army that is struggling to capture Ukrainian towns no longer looks like a regional powerhouse. When protests flared in Kazakhstan or border tensions rose between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Moscow offered words, not action. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, once seen as the mini NATO for post-Soviet allies, looks hollow. We saw this weakness play out in real time. Back in early 2022, Kazakhstan was on fire, literally. Fuel prices shot up, protests exploded, and within days, government buildings were burning in Almaty. President Tokayev was concerned. His security forces were overwhelmed, and the unrest was spreading fast. So he made the call. Bring in the CSTO. That's Russia's post-Soviet security club. It was the first time they'd ever been invited to step in like this. Russia didn't hesitate. Around 2,500 troops flew in from Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to hold key sites, calm the chaos, and send a message. They guarded airports, government offices, and major infrastructure. No bullets, no battles, just presence. And within a week, they packed up and left, claiming they'd stopped a terrorist threat that never quite showed its face. Tokayev stayed in power, and Putin got to say the alliance still worked. But what looked like a win for Moscow turned out to be something else entirely. Tokayev didn't use the moment to tighten ties with Russia. He used it to clean the house. He pushed out loyalists tied to former President Nazarbayev and shaped the power structure around himself. Russia gave him breathing room, but he didn't pay for it with loyalty. No new deals, no deeper alignment, just a quiet nod and a shift in direction. This shift was towards China. Not long after the troops left, Kazakhstan started signing fresh Belt and Road deals, billions in rail upgrades, energy tech, and logistics. Chinese firms moved in fast, offering money with fewer strings and more speed. Russia saw the intervention as a favor. Kazakhstan saw it as a reset. The message was clear: thanks for the help, but we'll take our future with Chinese financing. This was a turning point. The CSTO could still land troops, but it couldn't land trust. And China, without firing a shot, was already building influence where Russia thought it had a lock. Even in crisis, the old safety net was wearing thin, and Beijing wasn't just watching, it was quietly stitching together a new one. Beijing has been careful not to make the same mistakes. In Tajikistan's Gorno-Badakhshan region, Chinese border troops now run small joint patrols near Afghanistan, officially for counterterrorism and drug control. This arrangement isn't about replacing Russia outright. It's about gathering experience and building trust, one patrol at a time. Under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Chinese officers now train with Central Asian counterparts on intelligence sharing and anti-terror operations. It's subtle, limited, and deniable. But it marks the beginning of a long game to fill the security vacuum Moscow can no longer manage. At the same time, Russia's diplomatic tone grows increasingly paternalistic. Officials in Moscow still talk about Central Asia as if it's a group of younger brothers who need guidance. But those younger brothers, they've grown up. Kazakhstan has been building trade with China and Europe for years. And it isn't about to risk that for empty slogans about Eurasian unity. Uzbekistan's leadership openly courts new investors, even from the United States. Turkmenistan has already tied most of its gas exports to Chinese buyers. Moscow's old playbook of nostalgia, intimidation, and shared history no longer works. Now, as Russia struggles to hold on to its fading influence, China is moving in quietly but deliberately. It isn't marching armies across borders or making loud demands for loyalty. It's doing something far smarter. It's building. Railways, factories, power plants, and loans have become a tool of persuasion. Where Moscow once used pressure and pride, Beijing now uses money and opportunity. Bit by bit, it's replacing Russia's presence with something far more durable. Control built through wealth, infrastructure, and patience. At the center of this quiet takeover is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has been transforming the landscape across Central Asia. China is funding highways that stretch from deserts to ports, upgrading old Soviet rail lines that now carry Chinese freight to Europe, and building new industrial parks that turn raw materials into finished goods before they even leave the region. Kazakhstan has embraced this transformation the most. Its new roads now link directly to Chinese trade hubs, bypassing the old Russian routes entirely. Uzbekistan's factories, powered by Chinese investment, are turning cotton and minerals into export-ready products. And in Turkmenistan, Chinese companies have secured major pipeline rights that once belonged to Moscow. Each project strengthens Beijing's grip, while quietly loosening Russia's hold. But this isn't just about construction. Every deal China signs is a lesson in influence. Energy is at the heart of it. Beijing doesn't simply buy oil and gas. It builds the pipelines, the refineries, and the rail links that carry them. Most of these are financed and maintained by Chinese companies, creating dependence that feels like progress. For Central Asian governments, the offer is hard to refuse. Quick cash, guaranteed buyers, and visible development that Russia can no longer afford to provide. On their end, it's kind of a no-brainer. Moscow still trades energy, but its deals come with strings, politics, and risk. Russia leans on nostalgia and pressure, while China offers stability and results. Beijing pays in hard currency, not promises, and every agreement signed with China moves these countries a little further away from Russian control. For Central Asian leaders who want growth and jobs, China isn't just an investor. It's the dependable partner that gets things done. And the thing about investing in infrastructure is that once the roads and the pipelines are in place, trade naturally follows. Over the past decade, China's exports to Central Asia have exploded. But this trade isn't just about selling goods. Chinese companies are setting up factories, hiring local workers, and embedding themselves in local economies. They're not visitors. They're becoming part of the daily life. And that kind of economic presence slowly turns into political influence, often before anyone ever realizes it. For Central Asian leaders, the choice between Moscow and Beijing isn't ideological anymore. it's practical. They ask who builds more schools, who creates more jobs, and who delivers results. The answer is almost always China. Beijing's financial strategy reinforces that shift. Its loans and investments are structured to keep partners tied to its economy. Chinese state-owned companies fund massive projects, and repayments often mean giving Beijing long-term control over key infrastructure or trade routes. It's not about debt traps, it's about economic gravity. The more these countries build with China, the harder it becomes to turn back towards Russia. Meanwhile, in the background, China's soft power fills in the cultural gaps. It sends students on scholarships, funds cultural exchanges, and promotes tourism. Joint archaeology projects and museum exhibitions honor local history, while subtly tying it to China's story. People meet Chinese teachers and engineers, not soldiers, and that changes how they see Beijing. It stops China from appearing to be a threat and makes it start feeling more like a partner. Diplomacy then comes in and completes the entire picture. Here, China hosts summits, leads multilateral forums, and plays a key role in regional groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They make China's leadership feel natural and permanent. While Russia keeps relying on old military ties and talks of shared Soviet history, China speaks the language of progress, investment, and stability. To make matters worse, right now, the difference between the two powers is unmistakable. Russia reacts, bogged down by war, sanctions, and exhaustion. China acts. It's calm, it's patient, and it's financially unstoppable. Moscow offers memories, while Beijing offers results. And for Central Asian leaders, it's not about choosing sides anymore. It's about choosing what works. Kazakhstan, the region's richest country and largest energy producer, shows this balancing act clearly. Astana keeps strong ties with Moscow through the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union. At the same time, pipelines, roads, and rail now increasingly point east and west, not just north. The China-Kazakhstan rail corridor has grown in recent years, letting Kazakh exports reach European markets without passing through Russia. A new gas deal signed this year will boost supplies to China by a third. Yet Kazakhstan still sells oil to Russia, conducts joint military exercises, and shares intelligence. It's a careful dance. Take advantage of Chinese infrastructure and capital while keeping Russia close enough to avoid conflict. Uzbekistan takes a more assertive approach. Tashkent has spent the last decade opening doors to Chinese investment, especially in industrial parks and resource processing. New rail lines bypass Russian ports entirely, but it does not ignore Moscow. By keeping a measured relationship with Russia, Uzbekistan gains concessions from both sides. Chinese investments bring factories, roads, and technical know-how. Russian ties offer political legitimacy and occasionally security guarantees. Uzbek leaders know that having multiple partners increases their bargaining power, a luxury they did not have in the 1990s. Uzbekistan's not the only one rewriting the rules. Kazakhstan, too, has been making quiet moves, and one of the clearest is its break from Russia's linguistic shadow. For decades, the Kazakh language was only written in Cyrillic, a leftover from Soviet times that kept the country culturally tethered to Moscow. Everything from school books to street signs carried the imprint of that legacy. But in 2017, President Nazarbayev signed off on a full switch to a Latin-based alphabet. The original deadline was this year, later pushed to 2031 to ease the transition. But the message was unmistakable. We're done using Russia's letters. And they followed through. Textbooks are now printed in Latin. Government documents often appear in both scripts, but Cyrillic is fading. Keyboards are being updated, and younger generations are learning the new alphabet from day one. This isn't just about modern fonts or easier tech integration, it's about identity. Latin script connects Kazakhstan more naturally to Turkic nations like Turkey and opens doors to global platforms. More importantly, it marks a clean break from the Russian cultural orbit. Putin tried to frame it as modernization, but inside Kazakhstan, it felt like something else entirely. De-Russification, a quiet but firm step away from Moscow's influence. And it's not happening in isolation. Mandarin classes are growing, Chinese-backed schools are opening. Kazakhstan isn't just changing alphabets, it's changing direction. The old Soviet glue that held the region together is losing its grip, and Russia's soft power is peeling off with it. Another of these nations, Turkmenistan, which relies heavily on its huge gas reserves, has leaned towards Beijing. New pipelines now carry most of Turkmenistan's gas exports, and Beijing has invested in major infrastructure to ensure smooth deliveries. For Ashgabat, this is not betrayal. It's practical economics. Russia still buys some gas, but it cannot compete with the scale and reliability of China's agreements. Turkmenistan's leaders see the benefits: guaranteed revenue, infrastructure investment, and fewer strings than Moscow ever offered. The smaller states, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, play a subtler but just as careful game. Their location makes them important for regional corridors and energy routes. Both countries accept Chinese loans for roads, railways, and energy projects, knowing these investments give them political and economic space. At the same time, they keep some dependence on Russian military help. Training programs, arms deliveries, and security guarantees still matter in countries with unstable borders. But the money, projects, and long-term growth increasingly come from Beijing, not Moscow. Put together, these examples show a clear pattern. Central Asian states are hedging. They are practical, not ideological. China offers the carrot: roads, railways, factories, and capital. Russia increasingly offers only speeches, military gestures, and nostalgia. Leaders in the region are not picking sides, they are picking the tools that work best for national development. The result is a quiet but major transformation of the region. Roads, pipelines, and industrial zones now define power more than embassies or military bases. Central Asian leaders are reshaping the balance of power without ever firing a single shot. Numbers speak louder than history, speeches, or military exercises. Central Asia is not choosing China out of ideology. It is choosing it because the statistics make sense. Trade, energy, and finance now flow east, and every delay or pause in Russian markets pushes leaders further towards Beijing. In recent years, a third player has started stepping back onto the board. The United States and the European Union, long content to let Moscow and Beijing just compete, are re-engaging with new energy. Washington's C5+1 format, which brings all 5 Central Asian leaders to the same table, has shifted from polite diplomacy to real coordination on trade and energy. The European Union, for its part, is funding a middle corridor transit route that runs from China through Kazakhstan into the Caspian Sea to Europe, bypassing Russian territory entirely. For Central Asia, this growing Western interest isn't about ideology, it's about options. The more partners they have, the less any single power can dictate terms. But the new Silk Roads aren't only built from steel and asphalt. They're digital too. Chinese tech giants like Huawei and ZTE are wiring Central Asia with 5G networks, cloud data centers, and surveillance systems sold under the banner of smart cities. The cables may be buried, but the influence runs deep. Whoever builds the digital backbone often ends up setting the rules for how data flows, how governments monitor information, and how economies modernize. Russia once had a stake in this space, but sanctions and the brain drain have left it trailing far behind. Beijing has stepped in to fill the gap, turning digital connectivity into another form of quiet control. Another factor shaping this relationship is the region's growing environmental stress. Central Asia is heating faster than the global average. Glaciers are retreating, and the old Soviet irrigation networks are breaking down. Water scarcity is now a political issue as much as it is an ecological one. China has spotted that opening. Through the Belt and Road's green energy branch, it's funding solar farms in Uzbekistan, wind projects in Kazakhstan, and modern irrigation systems along the Sirdarya. For local governments, this isn't just about clean energy. It's about survival. Moscow has little to offer in this area, while Beijing is positioning itself as a partner that can literally keep the lights on and the water flowing. This multi-vector approach is why the idea that Central Asia is siding with China is often exaggerated. These governments are not leaving Moscow because they are loyal to Beijing. They are acting as sovereign nations. They take the most from both great powers and make sure no single actor dominates their choices. They play Moscow and Beijing like chess opponents, advancing their own agendas while letting the giants compete for influence. But aren't Moscow and Beijing the best of friends? Well, at first glance, Russia and China seem like allies. They hold summits, they sign joint statements, and they speak together against the West. On paper, it looks like a partnership based on shared interests. But the reality on the ground is very different. The alliance is more illusion than fact. It is transactional, fragile, and increasingly benefits China more than Russia. Recently, this point was proven on the global stage. Beijing's sudden pullback from Russian oil imports sent shockwaves through both global energy markets and the Kremlin's inner circle. In late October, Washington imposed sweeping sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's top oil producers. The restrictions were brutal, cutting off shipping insurance and financial access for Russian crude, all designed to choke the funding behind the war in Ukraine. Moscow expected its ally in Beijing to push back, maybe even help keep the oil flowing. Instead, China stepped back. Within days, Beijing's state-owned giants PetroChina, Sinopec, CNOOC, and Shenhua Oil froze seaborne imports of Russian crude. The move stunned traders and rattled markets, sending Brent crude hovering to nearly $94 a barrel. Moscow scrambled to save face, blaming technical adjustments. But the message was clear. Beijing had chosen economic safety over loyalty. For Russia, it was a gut punch. Rosneft and Lukoil together pump out nearly half of Russia's 4 million barrels a day in exports. After Europe slammed its doors shut, China became the lifeline, buying millions of barrels through discounted deals that kept Moscow's war chest alive. Now, that lifeline is starting to fray. The optics couldn't be worse. This solidifies a long-known point, that China never saw Russia as an equal partner. It saw it as a pawn. The imbalance becomes clear when you compare the two countries. China has the world's second largest economy, patient capital, and a long-term strategy that stretches over decades. Russia, by contrast, relies on military presence, political theater, and short-term deals. Moscow wants influence, respect, and loyalty from its neighbors. Beijing wants stability, access to resources, and reliable trade routes. China thrives on predictability. Russia, they thrive on volatility. Economic power is China's real advantage. Every highway, rail line, pipeline, and factory funded by Chinese money creates dependence. Central Asian states work, pay, and plan around China. Russia, even at its strongest, cannot match that kind of influence. From Moscow's perspective, all of this can feel like betrayal. When Central Asian leaders choose Chinese loans over Russian promises, it might seem disloyal. In reality, it's just smart self-interest. Leaders make decisions based on real outcomes, not ideology. Jobs, factories, energy supplies, and infrastructure matter far more than nostalgia for a shared Soviet past. China is also careful not to overcommit militarily. It does not promise to intervene if a crisis erupts. It focuses on business, connectivity, and long-term integration. Russia expects loyalty from post-Soviet states because it assumes a shared history equals obligation. Beijing does not make that same mistake. Smarter states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan make this clear. When offered a Russian security deal versus a Chinese credit line for roads or energy projects, the choice is obvious. Leaders weigh which options bring jobs, schools, and functioning infrastructure. China usually wins because it delivers immediate, measurable benefits. With every project China completes, the imbalance grows. Roads connect cities, factories create jobs, pipelines secure energy, and loans enforce compliance. Russia can offer speeches, parades, and nostalgia. China offers results. Central Asian leaders are not naive. They see who is winning, and it is Beijing, without firing a shot. For Moscow, the hard truth is this. The so-called alliance is mostly a myth. Russia has leverage through history and military presence, but China has influence through money and infrastructure. The two countries may cooperate in some areas, but the partnership is one-sided. Beijing controls the keys to economic growth. Moscow controls the memories and the rhetoric. Central Asian leaders know which of these is more valuable for the future. Even as China makes gains, its dominance in Central Asia is not guaranteed. Beijing's approach is strong, but it has limits, and several factors could slow down or even reverse its progress. Debt is one of the quiet levers China uses to stay in control. Most of the big projects in Central Asia, like roads, power plants, and industrial zones, aren't gifts. They're built with Chinese loans, often tied to Chinese companies, Chinese workers, and Chinese materials. On the surface, it looks like progress. Countries get new infrastructure, jobs, and trade routes. But those loans don't disappear. They come with long-term obligations that shape how governments spend, negotiate, and even vote. The repayment terms aren't always clear to the public, but they're felt over time. Some loans are backed by future resource exports, others by control over key infrastructure. If a country hits economic trouble, those debts don't just sit there, they become leverage. China doesn't need to threaten anyone, it just waits. The more a country builds with Chinese money, the more its decisions start to align with Beijing's interests. This is where things get tricky. In places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, local communities have started pushing back. Some are unhappy with Chinese labor practices. Others worry about environmental damage or the sheer scale of foreign involvement. If people feel left out or exploited, protests follow. And when that happens, projects stall, deals get renegotiated, and China has to adjust. It's not just about economics anymore. It is about politics. Leaders in Central Asia know they can't ignore public opinion. National pride still matters. So while they welcome Chinese investment, they also use local pressure to push back when needed. It's a balancing act. They want roads and factories, but they don't want to look like they've sold out. And China, for all of its financial power, prefers calm. It often gives ground quietly, tweaking terms or slowing timelines to keep things moving. This isn't old-school empire building. It's something more subtle. Debt isn't used to punish. It's used to bind. The more these countries borrow, the more they're being pulled into China's orbit. And once they're in, turning back isn't easy. Every loan is a step deeper into a system where Beijing sets the pace, and everyone else just tries to keep up. Still, overdependence carries its own risks. In Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, anti-China protests have erupted over fears of land sales, opaque loan terms, and imported labor. Some projects stalled under public pressure, forcing Beijing to renegotiate quietly behind closed doors. Inside China, banks are growing more cautious too. tightening Belt and Road lending after a series of costly defaults abroad. For Central Asia, that means future financing could slow, and with it, the momentum of development. Beijing's patience may be long, but it isn't limitless. If local backlash grows or debt repayments falter, even China's confidence in the region could waver. Overreach is one of the few areas where China still has to tread carefully. For all of its money and infrastructure, it can't offer what Russia still does best: security. Moscow remains the region's main arms supplier. It runs training programs, sells military hardware, and maintains defensive pacts that smaller states still rely on. Countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and even Kazakhstan continue to cooperate with Russia on military drills and intelligence sharing. For them, Russia is still the go-to partner when it comes to border defense, counterterrorism, and regional stability. China might be building roads and pipelines, but it hasn't built trust in the security space. And if Beijing tries to move too fast into that domain, it risks triggering resistance. Governments may welcome Chinese investment, but they're not ready to swap out Russian tanks for Chinese ones quite yet. That's partly because Central Asia isn't a two-player game. The region is crowded with outside interests. Turkey is pushing cultural and linguistic ties. The European Union and the United States offer development aid and diplomatic support. India is expanding trade and tech partnerships. Iran is looking for energy deals and regional leverage. Central Asian leaders know this, and they use it all to their advantage. They don't want to be anyone's satellite, so they hedge, taking money from China, security from Russia, and political cover from the West. It's not about loyalty, it's about leverage. And that's why the future is anything but fixed. Russia could try to claw back influence by squeezing energy flows or leaning harder on old alliances. China might counter with more loans, faster construction, or a charm offensive through education and media. Central Asian governments, for their part, will keep playing both sides. They'll take what they need, delay what they don't, and shift course when it suits them. Nothing is locked in. Every deal, every handshake, every pipeline comes with trade-offs. In a region where power is always shifting, the smartest move is often to stay flexible. Because in Central Asia, the game isn't about choosing sides, it's about staying in control. For Putin, things are looking rough. Losing Central Asia isn't just a political blow, it's a financial and strategic one too. The energy money that used to flow steadily into Moscow is now being rerouted or locked into deals with China. Roads, railways, and pipelines funded by Chinese investment are helping Central Asian countries grow stronger while pulling them away from Russia's grip. Putin's influence, built on military presence and old historical ties, is really no match for signed contracts and poured concrete. Every new factory, highway, or loan that comes from Beijing chips away to Russia's ability to negotiate, both at home and abroad. And that erosion is starting to show. Russia's traditional role as a gatekeeper of Central Asia is fading, and with it goes a major source of leverage. These were countries that once looked to Moscow for everything: security, trade, and political backing. Now they're looking east. China doesn't just offer money, it offers momentum. Its projects move fast, its deals are clear, and its presence is growing in ways that Russia can't match. The Kremlin may still have military ties, but those don't build economies. They don't create jobs, and they don't win long-term loyalty. The shift is being watched closely around the world. For Western powers, it's a sign that Russia's sphere of influence is shrinking. For China, it's confirmation that its strategy is working. And for countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, it's a blueprint. Beijing is showing that you don't need tanks to take territory. You just need trade routes, loans, and patience. That kind of influence travels well. It's quiet, scalable, and hard to push back against once it's in place. Inside Russia, the consequences are piling up. Losing ground in Central Asia weakens Putin's image as a global power broker. It makes his foreign policy look reactive, not strategic. And it chips away at the narrative he's built for years, that Russia is surrounded, under siege, and fighting to reclaim its rightful place. If the countries next door are walking away, that story starts to fall apart. Domestic critics notice. So do oligarchs, regional governors, and the military brass. They see the deals slipping, the influence fading, and the Kremlin struggling to keep pace. This isn't just about prestige, it's about power. When Russia loses leverage abroad, it loses confidence at home. It becomes harder to justify spending on foreign adventures, harder to rally support around nationalist slogans. It's harder to claim that the West is the only threat when China is quietly taking over their neighborhood. And as Putin's options narrow, his authority starts to look more fragile. Not because of one defeat, but because of a slow, steady loss of relevance. Central Asia was supposed to be a safety zone, a region where Russia could always count on loyalty. Now it's becoming the test case for what happens when loyalty fades. And the answer isn't good news for Moscow. The more China builds, the more Russia shrinks. And the more Russia shrinks, the more the world begins to see Putin not as a master strategist, but as a man losing control of his own backyard. At the end of the day, Central Asian leaders are not betraying Moscow out of malice. They are exercising sovereignty, making rational choices that secure development and stability. To Moscow, these decisions feel like treachery. To the rest of the world, they are a clear sign of how power is evolving. If Russia used to believe itself indispensable to its neighbors, that belief has dissolved. Influence is no longer a product of history or force alone. It's measured by results. And the corridors of trade now speak louder than borders. The map of Eurasia is being redrawn, not by generals, but by planners, investors, and engineers. The final question lingers. If boardrooms, banks, and infrastructure projects are shaping influence more than armies and politics, what does this mean for the future of conflict and cooperation in Eurasia? What we are seeing is a world that is changing, and those who follow the old rules of geopolitics may find themselves left behind. Thanks for watching.